The most expensive wedding of the year has just ended in 90 seconds. Not with vows, with a bride throwing her veil at the groom's feet and walking out. But here's what the cameras missed. Paul Higgins planned this, every detail. The red carpet, the imported flowers, the drones filming from above. And the front row seat reserved for his ex-wife Naomi, the woman he publicly called barren for 7 years. He wanted her humiliated. He wanted her watching him start the family she couldn't give him. Then a Bentley pulled up. Naomi stepped out, and she had 2 sons with her, twins. The hall went silent. His bride turned to him with one question. "You said she couldn't have children." Paul's empire, his reputation, his wedding, his lies collapsed before he could even say "I do." Paul wanted a spectacle, his ex-wife seated in shame while he said "I do." But when the Bentley door lifted and Naomi stepped out with twins, the wedding fell silent. The show he planned wasn't the one he got. They'd rolled out the red carpet as if the grass itself needed training. Strings shimmered under the tinted sky, champagne flutes chimed, and drones hovered like obedient stars, recording every angle of Paul Higgins's victory. He stood at the lip of the aisle with that controlled smile his publicist loved. Measured, expensive, unbothered. 40 looked good on him because he had money to sand down the edges. The MC was mid-joke when the car arrived. Not just any car, the Bentley Continental GT, paint like wet ink, chrome bright enough to argue with the sun. Heads pivoted in little waves. The camera crew panned, then stopped, as if vision itself had hit a wall. The rear door opened. A heel, gold. A hem, gold. Naomi. She stepped down like someone who had rehearsed not the pose, but the piece. No rush, no theatrical blink. Just the hush of a woman who knew her own temperature. In each of her hands, a child gripped. 2 boys, mirror images with solemn eyes that broke into smiles as soon as they saw the red carpet. Their suits were little echoes of manhood, crisp shirts, warm brown skin, tight curls defiant against the breeze. A gasp rose and didn't quite land, as if the crowd couldn't find a place to set it. Whispers ricocheted through designer lace and freshly shaved beards. "Is that? It can't be." "Naomi," Paul's smile tried to hold. For a heartbeat, he looked like a statue commissioned to look triumphant. Handsome, immovable, hollowed out by the sculptor's chisel. Only his eyes moved, tiny flints striking nothing. He had placed her name on the guest list himself. Front row. He imagined her there, alone, slim shoulders caved, a moral lesson disguised as seating. He wanted that lens flare, the one that catches tears. Instead, lenses caught gold, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that glows. Naomi didn't search for anyone. She didn't have to. Silence makes maps. It cleared for her and the boys, parted the crowd like etiquette learned something new. When she neared the aisle, one of the twins tugged her hand and whispered, "Is this the place, Mommy?" She smiled without showing teeth. "It's just a room," she murmured, "with chairs." 3 steps from the front, she finally lifted her eyes. They met Paul's and did not waver. His mouth opened, but nothing assembled. Next to him, the best man moved a fraction closer, the way you inch toward a ledge when you don't trust the railing. "And that," someone breathed behind a folding arm, "is the woman he called barren." For a long second, the orchestra forgot their bows. When they remembered, the notes came out thin. The photographer lowered his camera, then raised it again, startled at his own hesitation. Some guests sat, some didn't. Even indecision became choreography. Naomi reached the front row, the seat Paul had reserved for her humiliation. She eased the boys into place, adjusted a collar here, a cuff there, and let her hand linger on a small shoulder until his breath steadied. Then she folded into the chair, back straight, chin easy, like a witness who has nothing to prove. The silence thickened, then cracked. A violin found the key. The MC coughed. The machine restarted poorly. Only then did Naomi glance at the altar, at the man she used to love, and at the woman beside him. Angela's gown was the kind that could silence a jewelry store. She looked from the children to Paul, to Naomi, and calculation flickered behind her veil, an Excel sheet of questions with no cells filled. Paul didn't notice. His eyes were on the boys, on their faces, on the shape of a truth that would not bend for him. The strings swelled on command. The officiant raised a hand. The script tried to proceed on tin, but stories don't care for scripts before the red carpet and the hush, before the Bentley and the camera's hesitation. Before everyone learned how loud dignity can be, there was a house where love worked overtime and pride got promoted. Paul's house liked light, floor-to-ceiling windows on every side, marble that made shoes feel shy, chandeliers that hung like frozen rain. In the evenings, the city admired itself in his glass. So did Paul. He told himself he wasn't vain. He was a curator. There was one thing he couldn't curate: legacy, not the legal kind, the living kind that learns your laugh and argues about your height. He wanted a son to mirror the jawline and inherit the company pen. He wanted a daughter to soften the rooms and sit beside him in photos that made shareholders smile. Mostly he wanted proof. Naomi learned his wants the way pianists learn scales. She paced herself with his calendar, pulled joy from the small, a perfect sauce, a quiet Sunday, a joke that landed. Her hands were good at remembering grocery lists, where he left his cufflinks, the name of a partner's wife. Her hands were good at forgetting, too, her own career, the projects she shelved because later sounded near when Paul said it. Months became years. Each month had a door. Behind each door, not yet. The chorus around them kept time. Maggie, Paul's mother, had eyes like sharpened teaspoons, small, reflective, and always scooping. Legacy needs a mother, she would say, tapping a manicured nail on the rim of her teacup as if summoning an air from steam. Some women are made for building homes, some for occupying them. Naomi smiled at the right temperature. She excused herself before the teacup cooled. In the bathroom, she learned how to cry without proof. Cool water, paper towel, a different lipstick. Paul read the unsent letters between the lines and chose the version of the story that left him spotless. He told himself it was biology, bad luck, God's delay, then, when patience grew old, Naomi. He never said the word aloud to colleagues, but he tried it on at home. It fit too easily. That's the trouble with blame. It runs your size. The night the house finally said enough, it was raining in that cinematic way that makes you think someone ordered it. Carpets drank mud, doors sighed, somewhere a clock forgot to tick. Paul came in with the storm on his shoulders and never bothered to shake it off. The argument didn't erupt. It compiled. Little entries posted to a ledger. A doctor's referral ignored, a holiday refused, the wrong tone in a prayer. He said things he thought were facts and labeled them truth to avoid apology. He said terrible things because terrible things are efficient. Naomi did the math out loud. Tests, time, hope. We can know, she said. We can check. Pride hates labs. Pride hates any room where answers come without permission. Pride is allergic to evidence when evidence isn't flattering. By midnight, the marriage had more verdict than vows. By morning, a suitcase sat like a period at the foot of the bed. No crowd, no music, no witnesses, unless you count the mirror. She left with her driver's license, a change of clothes, and a spine that refused to fold even when her heart did. In the rain, the city felt too large, than just large enough. She didn't go home. This was home. She went to Annabelle's instead. Annabelle answered the door the way sunlight answers morning, immediately. She pressed tea into Naomi's trembling fingers, ignored the perfect manicure she'd ruined by holding someone who was falling apart, and said the sentence that rearranged the room. You are not the problem. It sounded like a dare. It felt like a diagnosis. It would become a map. Naomi slept that night like sleep was something you negotiate with, not something that arrives politely. In the morning, she went with Annabelle to a clinic where the walls were kind and the doctor was kinder. Later, there would be news. Later, there would be Tony and laughter that didn't need an audience and a pair of heartbeats that turned silence into music. Later still, there would be a gold dress and two little hands and a car door opening on a lawn that loved gossip more than grass. But first there was the leaving, and there was the man who could not imagine a woman whole without him. Back at the wedding, Paul tried to move the ceremony forward like a host prodding a stalled show. The officiant cleared his throat. The strings recovered their courage. Angela leaned in, voice veiled, but not soft. Who are those children, Paul? He swallowed a stone. This is not, who are they? The boy on Naomi's right swung his legs and counted the diamonds in the chandelier. The other pushed his palm flat on the program booklet and traced the letters the way children do when they're almost reading. What happens next will shock you even more. But before we dive deeper, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of other unbelievable stories. Naomi looked at her sons, then at the aisle, then at the man who had once told her that legacy was a test she had failed. She rested her hand over a small knee and smiled, not at Paul, not at the guests, not even at the cameras, but at a private memory that would carry her through the next hour. A voice in her, steady as breath, said, "We are here." They had not always been here. Before the chandeliers and the hush, there was the night the suitcase clicked shut. The sound was smaller than heartbreak deserved, just metal finding metal, yet it divided her life into befores and afters. Outside, rain drew ladders on the glass. Inside, Naomi folded a sweater she had slept in on happier winters, slipped a photograph into the pocket of a coat she could no longer afford to wear, and told her hands to stop shaking. The driver did not meet her eyes at the gate. He was a kind man, but kindness can be a liability in a house that admires hardness. He placed the suitcase in the trunk, the way one sets down a fragile thing that belongs to somebody else, and held the rear door as if he were attending a funeral. "Madam," he said, and that was all. The city was a blur. Neon made promises and broke them in the same breath. Naomi watched her reflection in the window, her face sliding across storefronts, taillights writing red cursive on rain-slicked streets, and felt the peculiar exhaustion that arrives after a long sprint you didn't know you were running. Her mind recited logistics to keep from crying, where to sleep, whom to call, which documents she had, which she didn't. She called Annabelle. "Come," her friend said. No interrogation, no gasp. The word landed like a key. Annabelle's apartment was a bright patch stitched into a tired building. Plants tilted toward lamps. Art leaned on the floor, arguing about frames. The door opened before Naomi knocked a second time. Arms, tea, a blanket that smelled like cinnamon and detergent. Love has remedies that medicine cannot prescribe. "What happened?" Annabelle asked softly. Naomi opened her mouth and nothing came out. It was not that she had no words, she had too many. They crowded her throat and jammed the doorway. Annabelle did not push. She sat beside her on the couch, knees touching, and let the silence become a bowl into which grief could pour itself without spilling. Eventually the words formed, the fight, the accusations, the decree that came like weather, inevitable, unnegotiable, cold. "Legacy needs a mother," Naomi echoed, hearing Maggie's voice without the teacup to hide behind, "as if I'm a factory that keeps missing a deadline." Annabelle made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse. "Factories do not pray," she said. "Factories do not hold their breath in ultrasound rooms. Factories are not women." Naomi smiled with one corner of her mouth and then broke. She wept the way the sky had wept on the drive over. Not for drama, not for pity, but because pressure finds a way out. That night she borrowed a t-shirt and socks too big and slept on Annabelle's couch with the stubborn half-sleep of the newly displaced. Every time she rolled, the cushion exhaled. Every time her mind reached for the shape of Paul beside her, it found only cold fabric and a wall painted a color she did not choose. Toward dawn, she dreamed she was packing a house built of fog. Her hands touched furniture and came back wet. Daylight makes even grief put on a coat. The morning brought practicalities. A toothbrush from the pharmacy downstairs, a call from a cousin who had heard something. News travels faster where people are hungry for it. A text from a church friend that started with "God knows" and then pivoted, almost delicately, into a rumor. Naomi turned the phone face down. She could bear either prayer or gossip that day, not both. The whispers began almost immediately. Women at the market, generous with cilantro and stingy with her compassion, dodged between versions of the story. Men on corners clicked their tongues and dispensed wisdom they'd borrowed from uncles who died lonely. Even the tailor who had fitted Naomi into joy once upon a time asked, while measuring another woman's hem, "So what did she do?" Naomi learned a new skill, walking through rumor like smoke, eyes forward, breath even. But smoke clings. By evening it had threaded her hair, her thoughts, her appetite. She pushed away a bowl of rice Annabelle set in front of her and said without drama, "I think I've failed at being a woman." Annabelle's spoon landed on the plate with a gentle clink. "Never say that again." "How else do I name this?" Naomi asked. And there was no bitterness in the question, only fatigue. Month after month of nothing, then this. If I am not the problem, then what is? "Not a what," Annabelle said, "a who. And you don't have to guess." Naomi looked at her. "You mean Paul?" "I mean pride," Annabelle replied, and her eyes softened. "And the family chorus he let conduct his heart." Naomi pressed her fingers to her eyelids and saw after images of chandeliers. "Maybe I am the chorus," she whispered. "Maybe they're right." Annabelle leaned back, the way one does when loading a bow. "Enough. Tomorrow we go to the clinic. And no more letting shame pretend to be truth," Annabelle said. "If there's a question, we ask a question. If there's an answer, we'll take the answer. But you will not live in a house built by other people's assumptions. Not again." Naomi wanted to refuse, not because she feared hospitals, but because she feared math. What if the numbers circled her like wolves and proved the chorus right? What if Data handed Paul a certificate labeled justified? She imagined handing that to Maggie like a report card. "Please," Annabelle said more softly. "Let's turn on the lights." Monsters shrink in a lit room. The clinic smelled of eucalyptus and floor polish. Someone had decided sterility should borrow a little dignity. Posters on the walls translated hormone chemistry into cartoons. In the waiting room, a toddler clapped at a fish tank while his mother counted seconds on her phone between contractions that were not yet contractions. A young couple sat pressed together at the front end of a row of chairs, knees colliding as if their bones were conspiring to keep them one person. A receptionist with the posture of a ballerina smiled without pity. "Name?" "Naomi Higgins," Naomi heard herself say, and then, catching the flash of her ringless hand in the glass of the desk, corrected gently, "Naomi." "Forms, questions written in medical, cycles, history, family." Naomi answered honestly and resisted the old impulse to write what would make someone else comfortable. Annabelle triple-checked dates in her phone and whispered the ones Naomi could not trust her memory to hold. They were led to a consultation room where the doctor was the right age to have made some mistakes and learned what not to do twice. Dr. Mensah introduced herself, offered water, and asked the kind of questions that leave space between them for breath. "We'll run a panel today," she said. "Basic hormone levels, a transvaginal ultrasound, a few standard screens. If you're ready." Naomi nodded. Ready is not an honest word, she thought, but willingness sometimes stands in for it. The ultrasound room was dim in a curated way, machines like sleeping animals, a monitor that waited without blinking. The technician narrated cheerfully, not with the bright nonsense of a children's show, but with the sturdy optimism of someone who has seen bodies repair themselves. "You'll feel a little pressure," she said. The wand was cold, then not. Naomi watched the monitor because the ceiling tiles felt like too much sky. Grays and blacks negotiated, blurred, sharpened, resolved. The technician measured with calm beeps. "Good linings," she murmured. "Follicles visible." Naomi did not understand the map, but she recognized relief in the technician's shoulders, a kind of settling. Blood draws followed. Vials lined like a chorus in a rack. Crimson evidence that she was not machinery. She stared at the cotton ball taped to her arm and imagined it was a medal for showing up. Results would take time. Time, the same commodity she had spent so recklessly over 7 years of hope. She spent the waiting days in Annabelle's apartment, reacquainting herself with silence that did not accuse. They walked for long stretches along a little river that tried its best to look like a lake. They cooked, badly at first. The salt went shy around them, but got better. They prayed in a way that was neither bargaining nor performance. Let the truth stop hiding. Sometimes Naomi cried mid-prayer and did not apologize. The whispers kept doing their job. A mutual friend texted, He signed so quickly, Maggie was in the room. Another sent a link to a photo of Paul at lunch with a woman in a dress that had never met a budget. Naomi did not click. She learned to delete without examining. To refuse some information is to protect the heart from a diet of poison. At 9:30 on a Thursday, the clinic called. "Can you come in at 11? Annabelle drove. At a red light, she reached for Naomi's hand and held it on the gear shift until the car behind them honked politely. Dermensa had the results on paper and on screen. She asked if Naomi preferred English or numbers. "Both," Naomi said, surprising herself. "Your ovarian reserve is within normal range for your age," the doctor began, voice even. "AMH is healthy, FSH is fine. The ultrasound showed no fibroids, no endometriosis we can detect. Hormones are balanced. Thyroid normal, prolactin normal, no markers of diminished ovarian function." Naomi waited for the but. The but did not come. "So? You are not infertile, Naomi," Dr. Mensah said. She did not smile like a television doctor. She looked like truth landing. "Conception is a duet. It takes two bodies cooperating. And when pregnancy does not occur, we evaluate both. Without examining your former partner, I cannot speculate on his health. I can only tell you confidently that you were not the problem you were told you were." Something in Naomi's chest made a sound she had not heard in years, the way a frozen lake sometimes sings when it thaws. She gripped the armrests and did not trust her legs. Relief flooded and quickly met anger in the corridor between ribs, collided, locked arms, spun like dancers who disagree about tempo. The doctor waited, which is a kind of care. When Naomi could speak, her voice arrived hoarse. "Then why," she swallowed, "why 7 years?" "Sometimes timing and stress pair up like thieves," Dr. Mensah said gently. "Sometimes male factors go untested because culture makes that conversation difficult." She did not say pride. She did not have to. "Sometimes there's no neatly labeled reason, but your body is not broken. Take that sentence home with you." Naomi nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again, as if she were negotiating with a verdict. Annabelle's hand found her shoulder, anchored it. In the parking lot, sunshine looked immodest. Cars glittered like they had opinions about everything. Naomi leaned against Annabelle's door and let her bag fall to the asphalt with a soft, embarrassed thud. "He wouldn't test," she said, and the sentence came out flat, without ornament. "All those years, and he wouldn't test." Annabelle did not say, "I told you." She did not strangle the air with curses. She stood and offered a clean square of linen from somewhere in her bag. Annabelle always had something practical folded, just in case. Naomi laughed through tears. "Who even carries handkerchiefs?" "Women who expect truth to make a mess," Annabelle said, and dabbed carefully, the way one cleans watercolor without turning it to mud. "Do you know what burns?" Naomi asked, words gathering momentum now that they had a target. "That he called me a curse, that I believed him, that I apologized every month to a God who didn't ask me to." Annabelle closed her eyes briefly. Grief bargains, shame obeys, but neither is God. They sat in the car without starting it, the way people do when they need a vessel to hold them a few minutes longer. Naomi thought of Maggie's teacup, of Paul's jaw tight in triumph, of the empty closet that was not empty anymore. It was somebody else's. She pictured herself walking into the old house, laying the lab results on the kitchen island like a deed, and saying, "Here, read this, and then learn how to say my name without your contempt in it." She pictured doing none of that. She chose a second picture. "Let's go home," she said. "Which home?" Annabelle teased softly, a smile in it. "The one that lets me breathe," Naomi answered. Healing did not introduce itself with trumpets. It arrived like mail, daily, ordinary, sometimes late, occasionally with surprises tucked in catalogs. Naomi made a schedule because emptiness expands to fill the day. Morning walks, job applications to places that would not look at her like she was a charity case, cooking with Annabelle until spices remembered their duty. She bought a notebook and wrote down only verbs. Walk, call, pray, apply, stir, or sleep. She reclaimed action from the narrative that had painted her passive. On Sundays, she went to a different church than the one where her wedding pictures were still in a dusty hallway album. She sat near the back and listened as if God were a language she needed to relearn. She did not ask for a child. She asked for clean eyes. One afternoon at a market where mangoes flirted with flies and women carried news and produce with equal balance, Naomi saw a man she recognized from Paul's circles. He saw her too. His face performed surprise and then rearranged into politeness. "How are you?" he asked. The question had splinters in it. "I am," Naomi said simply and moved on. She was no longer auditioning for other people's expectations. Later, when Shame tried on a new dress and stood in the mirror, "What if everyone knows?" she countered with a sentence Dr. Mensa had placed like a brick in her pocket. "Your body is not broken." She repeated it while washing dishes, while waiting for rice to boil, while stepping out of the shower and drawing a heart on the fogged glass with her finger, like a girl who believed in romance. At night, the old house visited anyway. She dreamed of corridors that lengthened when she ran, of doors that locked themselves with tiny smug clicks, of Maggie's spoons stirring air. In the dreams, her hands were empty. She woke, heart misfiring, and counted the good things in the room. Annabelle's plants breathing softly, a book open, face down, like someone resting after a long conversation. Her own breath, which had never abandoned her, even when she had begged it to quicken and become the breath of two. On a Tuesday that smelled like oranges, she made a decision that was small and enormous. She would not measure herself against anyone's calendar again. She tore the old fertility app from her phone like a badge surrendered. She deleted saved searches that began with "Why can't I?" and replaced them with "Where can I?" She signed up for a short course in food entrepreneurship at a community center that taught Hope not to be allergic to spreadsheets. Sometimes anger still arrived, punctual, looking for attention. She let it sit beside her instead of inside her. "You were right to be loud when you were loud," she told it once, stirring stew. "But you cannot be the only voice." The first seed of her new life was not a person. It was an idea in a saucepan. Naomi cooked like memory itself was an ingredient. Her mother's jollof that forgave you for eating fast. Her aunt's pepper soup that opened sinuses and secrets. A stew she invented one afternoon that made Annabelle lean on the counter and say, with her eyes closed, "We could sell this." The second seed was indeed a person, though she did not know it yet. He would come to her stand one day in a white shirt with sleeves rolled just so and say, "Spicy, please." And she would learn that love sometimes orders the same thing twice before it learns your name. But that was later. For now, the seed was a sentence she had learned to carry: "I am not broken." She planted it daily. It sprouted slowly. Some mornings it looked like nothing but damp soil. Other mornings a green edge cut the dirt just enough to catch sun. She watered it with choices: sleep, letters unsent, laughter invited back into rooms it had avoided. Annabelle watched and clapped for every millimeter, as if growth were athletic. "Do you ever think about going back?" Annabelle asked once, the kind of friend who would never judge the answer. Naomi thought of the old house with its eager mirrors. She thought of Paul's jaw, set like an alarm. She imagined stepping over that threshold and finding the same posture waiting for her. She imagined carrying her new sentence into a room built to smother it. "No," she said, and surprised herself with how gentle the word felt. "I think about going forward." Annabelle nodded as if that were the most obvious direction. On the afternoon, the clinic mailed hard copies of her results, paper, ink, signatures that made truth official. Naomi did something ceremonial and only slightly ridiculous. She placed the envelope on the kitchen table, unfolded each sheet, smoothed it with both palms, and read it aloud as if the apartment were a courtroom. And this was the testimony of a reliable witness. "Normal, normal, normal." At the bottom, Dr. Mensa had added in her precise hand, "Please remember, conception requires two healthy contributors. Consider partner testing for a comprehensive evaluation." Naomi did not need to read the footnote to understand it, but she read it anyway because the act of reading felt like lifting something heavy onto the correct shelf. Then she folded the papers again, not like secrets, but like recipes, things you want to keep near, and slid them into a folder labeled with her name. Nothing else. She tucked the folder into the drawer where spare light bulbs lived. The symbolism made her smile. Annabelle came home to find the table cleared, the apartment smelling like fried plantain, and Naomi's face wearing a look Annabelle had not seen in a year. "Tell me," she said. Naomi poured chilled water, the kind that makes the glass sweat. "I am not broken," she said, and the sentence no longer sounded like defiance. It sounded like inventory. Annabelle nearly knocked over the pitcher in her delight. "Then we celebrate," she declared, the way generals declare the armistice. "Not because a paper gave you permission to be whole, but because you are remembering what God never forgot." Naomi laughed, a sound with mischief in it, and reached for plates. "Plantain is the liturgy," she said. "Stew is the hymn." They ate like women with futures. That night the dream came again. The house, the corridor, the doors that locked themselves. This time Naomi did not run. She reached into her pocket and found a key. It was small, homely, nicked from use, the kind of key that looks like it belongs to a mailbox. She turned it in the nearest impossible door. The lock protested, then yielded with the same small click a suitcase had made months earlier. On the other side was not the old home. It was a kitchen painted in light, a stovetop with two pots singing, and the faint sound, just barely audible, of boys laughing in a room she could not yet see. She woke with her heart steady. Back at the wedding that wasn't, the room held its breath around the quiet woman in gold. Naomi's smile remained small and private, a password shared between past and present. Across the aisle, the man who had measured her worth in airs shifted his stance, as if the ground had opinions. A violin faltered, found itself again. The officiant's voice attempted dignity. Somewhere outside, a drone adjusted its angle to catch the moment the story chose to break character. What the crowd did not know was this. The woman before them had already won something no aisle could give. The first victory was not the twins at her side or the Bentley at the curb. It was a sentence planted in the dark and watered with tears until it learned to hold its own weight. "I am not broken." The rest of her life would grow from that root. Naomi had carried the weight of Paul's rejection like a second skin, heavy and clinging. Even after the clinic confirmed she was not barren, even after Annabelle's words stitched small patches of hope into her, she still felt like someone learning to walk after a fall. Healing, she realized, was not a thunderclap. It was a long road with uneven stones, and some days she stumbled. But Annabelle wouldn't let her stay down. Annabelle's apartment slowly transformed into something that felt like home for Naomi. In the mornings, they would sit by the window drinking tea, watching the neighborhood stir awake. Annabelle had a way of making ordinary things sound like rituals. Watering her plants became morning prayers for the green, frying eggs was an offering to the day. Naomi began to learn how to smile again, not the practiced smile she had worn at Paul's dinner parties, but the kind that rose uninvited, small and honest. "Let's keep your hands busy," Annabelle said one afternoon as they sat together folding laundry. "Work is good medicine, and you, Naomi, have always had good hands." Naomi laughed. "Good hands don't stop a broken heart." "No," Annabelle said, tucking a pillowcase into the basket. "But they build new things to carry it." So they started small, selling Naomi's cooking at a weekend market, then slowly expanding into a little stand where neighbors began to recognize her face again, not as Paul Higgins's ex-wife, but as the woman with the stew that tastes like comfort. Each plate she served was a defiance, a testimony that she still had something to give. With each passing week, Naomi began to see herself less as the woman Paul had cast aside and more as the woman God had kept standing. It was on one of those bright Saturdays at the market that Naomi met Tony. He wasn't flashy, not the kind of man who entered a room demanding attention. He was simple in his posture, his rolled-up sleeves, his easy way of talking to strangers like they were old friends. He carried himself with the steadiness of someone who had seen storms and survived them. Tony ordered her stew, spicy. He took a bite, nodded slowly, and said, "This tastes like home, even though I don't know whose home it is." Naomi smiled politely, her customer service smile. "Thank you." But Tony lingered, not in an intrusive way, but with genuine curiosity. "Did you make this yourself?" "Yes," she said cautiously. "Then you've put more into it than ingredients," he replied. "There's something strong in it." It wasn't the kind of compliment Naomi was used to. Paul had once told her she was beautiful, but only when she wore the dresses he chose. He had praised her cooking, but only as if it were part of her duty. Tony's words weren't about her looks or her service. They were about her resilience, and that startled her. She brushed it off, served the next customer, but when she looked up again, Tony was still there, smiling faintly, like he had all the time in the world. The days turned into weeks, and Tony began to show up at the market regularly. Sometimes he bought stew, sometimes just bread, sometimes nothing at all, just to say hello. Naomi began to wonder what he wanted, but he never crossed boundaries, never pressed too far. "Why do you come here so often?" she asked once, half teasing, half wary. Tony shrugged. "Because I like the food, and because I think the woman behind the table has more stories than she tells." Naomi lowered her eyes. "Some stories are not for telling." "Then let them rest," Tony said gently. "The ones you want to tell will come in their time." Naomi was not used to this kind of patience. With Paul, everything had been urgency and pressure. With Tony, silence was allowed to exist without judgment, and slowly she began to open, not all at once, but in fragments. One day she told him about her favorite childhood memory, running through her grandmother's compound during rain, slipping in mud, and laughing so hard her belly hurt. Another day she admitted she hadn't laughed like that in years. Tony listened. He never tried to fix her words, never offered pity. He simply made space for them. As months passed, their bond deepened. Tony would sometimes walk her home after the market, carrying heavy baskets without being asked. They shared meals at Annabelle's apartment, where Annabelle eyed him with quiet approval. "Good man," Annabelle said once after Tony had left. Naomi frowned. "You can't know that after just a few dinners." Annabelle raised an eyebrow. "I know men who use words like weapons, and I know men who use them like bandages. He is the second kind." Naomi didn't respond, but the thought stayed with her. Their friendship grew like a plant watered in secret, slow, steady, unshowy, but undeniable. Naomi found herself laughing more often. Tony's humor wasn't loud, but it was warm, the kind that made ordinary moments memorable. Once, while helping her set up at the market, he joked, "If I keep carrying these baskets, people will think I work for you." Naomi smirked. "Then I hope you like low pay and long hours." "Only if it comes with your stew," he replied, and they both laughed. Even with all this, Naomi still hesitated. The wounds Paul had left were deep, and fear whispered at her whenever Tony's kindness grew too consistent. What if he changed? What if he was only pretending? One evening she voiced it. "I don't trust easily anymore. I can't afford to." Tony looked at her, steady and calm. "Then don't. Let trust take its time. I'm not here to rush you." Naomi felt tears prick her eyes. "Why are you here then?" "Because I see someone worth knowing," he said simply. Not for what she lost, but for who she is. Those words lodged in her heart like seeds. It took nearly a year of friendship before Tony asked her the question. By then, Naomi had grown used to his presence, his patience, his quiet way of making space for her. They were walking by the river one evening, the city lights softening the water. Naomi had just finished laughing at one of his stories when he stopped, turned to her, and said, "Hey, Naomi, I don't want to rush what we have, but I also don't want to pretend I don't feel what I feel. You've rebuilt so much. You've stood tall again. And if you'll let me, I want to stand beside you, not to replace what you lost, but to build something new with you. Will you marry me?" There was no ring pulled out with flourish, no audience, no staged perfection. Just a man, steady and sincere, offering his life in quiet love. Naomi's throat tightened. For a moment, Paul's shadow tried to whisper in her mind, but it was drowned out by the memory of laughter, of kindness, of patience. She realized she was allowed joy. She was allowed to say yes. So she did. "Yes, Tony, yes." His smile was the kind that doesn't ask for proof. It was enough. When the wedding came, it was nothing like the spectacle Paul had once made of his. It was simple. Flowers gathered from neighbors' gardens, chairs borrowed from the church. A dress Naomi had altered herself. Annabelle stood proudly as her maid of honor, tears slipping down her cheeks as she watched her friends smile again. A few close friends gathered, clapping and singing softly, filling the small hall with warmth instead of grandeur. Tony took Naomi's hands and whispered his vows, not loud enough for everyone to hear, but clear enough that she believed every word. She whispered hers back, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with joy. When they were pronounced husband and wife, there was no roar of cameras, no champagne showers, just a long embrace, a kiss filled with tenderness, and applause from the people who mattered. For Naomi, it was more than a wedding. It was a resurrection, a chance to live again. Not as Paul's discarded wife, not as the woman the world pitied, but as Naomi, whole, cherished, and loved. And for the first time in years, her heart whispered something new. Maybe this is the life I was always meant to have. Naomi's new life began in whispers, not in trumpets. There were no chandeliers watching her every move, no servants running to polish her shadow, no sharp words filling the corners of the house. Instead, there was peace, a peace so quiet that it took her weeks to believe it was real. With Tony, life was measured not by headlines or cars, but by the sound of laughter over supper, the warmth of shared prayers in the morning, and the gentleness of being seen, not as an accessory, not as a burden, but as a woman whose presence mattered. The first thing Naomi noticed in her new home was how Tony listened. He listened when she spoke of the smallest details, how she liked her tea strong, how her mother used to hum while peeling yams, how she feared sleeping alone because of dreams that still chased her. He listened without rushing, without dismissing. It was a quiet balm that began to stitch the torn fabric of her heart. "Here, Naomi," he said one evening, as they shared a simple meal of rice and stew. "Here you can breathe." And for the first time in years, she did. Life with Tony was not grand, but it was good. Naomi found joy in little rituals, walking with him to the market, cooking together in their modest kitchen, laughing when he cut vegetables unevenly. Annabelle visited often, her laughter filling the home with warmth. "See how love softens you," Annabelle teased one afternoon, as Naomi stirred a pot of agouti soup. Naomi smiled shyly. "It's different, Annabelle. This love doesn't demand, it gives." Tony, overhearing, chuckled from across the room. "And it eats whatever you cook, even if the salt misbehaves." They laughed, and the house seemed to laugh with them. Naomi's heart slowly unlearned fear. Where once she measured her worth by Paul's cold eyes, she now measured her days in gratitude. And every night before she closed her eyes, she whispered a simple prayer: "Thank you for peace." It was in the middle of this peace that change stirred. Months into their marriage, Naomi began to feel unusual fatigue. At first, she dismissed it as stress or perhaps the strain of running the small food stand they had expanded together. But soon the fatigue was joined by waves of nausea in the mornings. Annabelle noticed it first. "You've been pale lately," she said, peering at Naomi with suspicion. "Is everything all right?" Naomi brushed it off with a laugh. "Maybe it's the weather." But Tony wasn't convinced. He watched her carefully, noting how quickly she tired, how her appetite shifted, how her body seemed to be speaking in ways she hadn't yet heard. One morning, as Naomi leaned over the sink fighting another round of nausea, Tony gently placed a hand on her back. "Naomi, I think we should see a doctor." Her heart skipped. The suggestion opened a door she had kept bolted shut. Memories of Paul's cruel words, "You are barren, you are a curse," rose like ghosts. Fear whispered that perhaps this was another cruel trick her body would play on her. She shook her head. "Tony, what if—" He turned her gently to face him. "What if it's good news?" he said softly. "What if God is rewriting the story?" His words hung in the air like sunlight after rain. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope. Naomi sat nervously on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tony sat beside her, his hand covering hers, his thumb drawing calming circles on her skin. The doctor entered with a warm smile. "Naomi Higgins?" "Yes," Naomi whispered. "What brings you in today?" Naomi hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I've been sick, tired, dizzy. I thought it was stress, but—" She trailed off. The doctor nodded knowingly. "Let's run some tests." Minutes turned into hours, the waiting heavy. Naomi's heart thudded in her chest as if it were counting down to a verdict. She had prayed for this moment for years, wept for it in the dark. What if it came now, when she least expected it? Finally, the doctor returned, holding the file. She sat across from Naomi and Tony, her face lit with a smile. "Naomi," she said gently, "congratulations. You are pregnant." The words hung in the air, too large for the room. Naomi gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. For years, she had carried the label of barrenness like a scarlet letter, and now, with one word, it was gone. "Pregnant?" she whispered, as if the word itself were fragile. The doctor nodded. "Pregnant." Naomi's tears spilled over, and she turned to Tony. His eyes were already wet, his lips trembling as he whispered, "Thank you, God." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were both treasure and miracle. "I told you," he whispered into her hair. "God is rewriting the story." Weeks later, Naomi returned for an ultrasound. Her heart raced as the technician guided her through the procedure. She clutched Tony's hand so tightly he winced, but he didn't let go. Then the screen lit up. "Do you see this?" the technician said, smiling. "Not one heartbeat, but two." Naomi froze. "Two?" "Yes," the technician laughed. "Twins! You're having twins!" Naomi broke into tears, overwhelmed. She buried her face in Tony's chest, words tumbling out between tears. "God, you gave me double for my shame." Tony laughed through his tears, kissing the top of her head. "Double blessings, Naomi. Double joy." Annabelle nearly screamed when she heard the news. She danced around the room, clapping her hands. "I knew it! I told you God wasn't finished. Twins! Naomi, you will carry double honor where the world tried to give you disgrace." Neighbors came to celebrate, bringing food, songs, and prayers. The little house buzzed with joy. Naomi stood in the middle of it, her hands resting protectively over her belly, her eyes shining with gratitude. Every day of her pregnancy was a step away from the pain of her past. She found strength in the gentle movements within her, the tiny reminders that life had taken root in her womb. Each kick, each flutter was a testimony louder than Paul's accusations had ever been. Tony became her shield and her joy, attending every appointment, cooking when she was too tired, whispering prayers over her belly at night. Annabelle visited often, fussing over Naomi with the ferocity of a sister. Naomi often stood before the mirror, hand on her swelling belly, whispering, "I am not broken. I was never broken." Her laughter returned, fuller than before. She sang while cooking. She prayed with gratitude instead of desperation. She dreamed of the children she would soon hold. For years she had been mocked as barren. Now she would be called mother, twice over. The day Naomi bought tiny clothes for the babies, she cried in the middle of the market. She touched the soft fabric and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Strangers passing by saw her tears, but also her smile, and they nodded knowingly. Her life had been rewritten, not with riches or fame, but with peace, with love, with children she had longed for. At night, when sleep was slow, Naomi would lie beside Tony, her hand on her belly, and whisper, "God, you gave me double for my shame." And deep inside, two little heartbeats answered. If Naomi's new life with Tony blossomed in whispers of peace, Paul's world thundered with applause and flashing lights. He had no room for silence. Silence, to Paul Higgins, was defeat. Noise meant relevance, and relevance meant power. And power, as far as Paul was concerned, was everything. In the months and years after Naomi left, Paul built an empire out of spectacle. His businesses thrived under his aggressive leadership, not because he was the wisest businessman, but because he understood one thing clearly. People respected what they could see, and Paul made sure they saw everything. A new skyscraper carried his name in glass. Billboards showed him cutting ribbons with foreign dignitaries. His garage became a gallery of imported cars, each model newer, louder, shinier than the last. He wore tailored suits from Paris, silk ties flown in from Italy, shoes polished so bright the city lights bent down to admire themselves in them. To a circle of admirers, Paul was the definition of success. But beneath the tuxedos and champagne, one truth continued to gnaw at him. He still had no child. He buried that truth under headlines, distractions, and new ventures, but it was there, waiting, whispering every time he looked in the mirror. Then came Angela. Angela wasn't like Naomi. Where Naomi had been soft-spoken, gentle, and quietly supportive, Angela was bold, vibrant, and fashionable to the point of spectacle. She belonged to a wealthy family, her father a known figure in politics, her mother a patroness of art galleries and charity galas. Angela didn't need Paul's money, she had her own, but she admired the kind of power he represented. Their romance moved at lightning speed. The city noticed when Angela appeared on Paul's arm at a gala, her gown a waterfall of silver sequins, her laughter ringing like bells above the music. Suddenly, Paul was not just a wealthy bachelor, he was half of the city's most talked-about couple. Lavish dinners followed, five-course meals in private dining rooms where the waiters bowed so low their foreheads almost kissed the marble. Paul sent Angela roses by the hundreds, jewelry worth fortunes, designer handbags in every color of the rainbow. Paparazzi followed them as if their love was a soap opera scripted for the masses. They gave interviews together, flashing smiles that looked rehearsed but convincing. "We are so excited for the future," Angela would say, touching Paul's arm with manicured fingers. And Paul, grinning at the cameras, would add, "Yes, a future filled with family, legacy, and love." Every word was aimed at the ghost of Naomi, the woman he had cast aside. He wanted the world to see that he had moved on, upgraded, and was about to secure the one thing Naomi failed to give him, a family. Their love was loud, but it wasn't deep. Paul didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He loved how Angela looked on his arm, how she dazzled in photographs, how she made investors lean in closer to deals just to say they were in the same room as Paul and Angela. Angela loved the attention too. She relished the headlines, the invitations, the endless gifts. Together, they fed each other's need for spectacle until their romance was less about two people in love and more about two brands merging into one powerful logo. To the public, it was intoxicating. To Paul, it was vindication. And when whispers began that a wedding was near, the city buzzed with anticipation. Paul had no intention of making his wedding a private affair. To him, marriage wasn't about vows, it was about victory. "Imported chandeliers," he told his event planner, snapping his fingers. "I want the hall dripping in light." "Done, sir," the planner said eagerly. "Call the Italian designer. Angela must have something custom, never before seen." "Of course. Get the most expensive floral arrangements flown in. Roses from Paris, lilies from Amsterdam. I don't want local." "Yes, sir." Every detail was chosen not for meaning but for spectacle. Luxury cars lined up for the bridal convoy. International guests confirmed their attendance. Politicians, celebrities, foreign businessmen, journalists fought for access, promising glowing coverage. Paul stood in the center of it all, puffed with pride. This was his revenge against whispers, against pity, against the empty ache of his past. The wedding would declare to the world that Paul Higgins was untouchable. And at the heart of it, unspoken but always present, was Naomi. Paul had no desire to reconcile with his ex-wife. In his mind, Naomi was a closed chapter, discarded and forgotten. But he wanted her to witness this spectacle, not from afar, not through rumors, but with her own eyes. "Make sure this invitation reaches her," he instructed coldly as he signed the gold-trimmed envelope. His planner hesitated. "Sir, isn't it unusual to invite an ex-wife?" Paul smirked. "That's the point. I want her to see what she lost. I want her seated where she can't look away." He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers tapping the desk. In his mind, he pictured Naomi walking in quietly, dressed plainly, sitting in humiliation while he exchanged vows with Angela under a ceiling of crystal light. He imagined the cameras capturing her sadness, the whispers mocking her, the city finally declaring him vindicated. It was not about love, it was about pride. And pride, Paul Higgins believed, was his true legacy. As the days sped toward the wedding, Paul grew intoxicated with the spotlight. His mother, Maggie, praised his choices, reminding him that Naomi had been a curse lifted from the family. Angela's friends filled social media with praise for the union of wealth and power. The city's elite called it the event of the decade. Paul barely noticed the cracks forming. He ignored the way Angela sometimes looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, the way her laughter faltered when children were mentioned. He overlooked the faint strain in her voice whenever talk of heirs arose. He told himself everything was perfect, Because in his world, appearances were everything. Behind the curtain of spectacle, the truth waited, silent and steady. A truth Naomi already carried in her body, in the two small lives that had rewritten her story. Paul didn't know it yet, but the very seat he reserved for Naomi's humiliation would become the stage for his own downfall. The morning the envelope arrived, Naomi almost missed it. It was tucked among bills, flyers, and a catalog promising discount furniture that lasts a lifetime. The golden trim caught her eye, shimmering faintly in the sunlight, spilling through the window. She frowned, setting aside the others, and ran her fingers over the thick paper. Her name was printed in bold cursive, Naomi Higgins. For a moment the world blurred. That name, once heavy, once broken, looked strange to her now, printed so proudly. She hesitated before opening it, her breath uneven. Somewhere deep inside, she already knew what it contained. The seal broke with a soft snap. The card unfolded with rehearsed arrogance. You are cordially invited to the union of Paul Higgins and Angela Montero. The wedding of the year. Venue. The Grand Pavilion. Date. Naomi's heart thudded once, hard, then silence. He nearly tore it in two. This is an insult, she cried, slamming the card on the table. He wants to humiliate you again, to parade his wealth, his new bride, his chandeliers, and to make sure you see it with your own eyes. Naomi, you must not go. Her voice shook with protective anger. She paced the living room like a lioness, waving her hands. After all he did, after the way he threw you out like yesterday's news, and now he dares to send this to you? Naomi sat quietly, her fingers resting on the card. Her face was calm, almost too calm, as if the storm had already passed through her and left only stillness. Annabelle, she said softly, I am not the woman he once cast aside. I am not empty, not broken. I have my sons. I have my peace. This invitation cannot take that away from me. Annabelle stopped pacing, staring at her. But why go? Why put yourself through the whispers, the stares? He wants to see you shrink, Naomi. Naomi lifted her head, her eyes steady. Then let him see me stand. That night, Naomi prayed long and hard. She looked at her sleeping twins, their small chests rising and falling in rhythm, their little fists curled in dreams. She touched their hair, kissed their foreheads, and whispered, You are my proof. You are my answer. You are the joy that silenced my shame. The next morning her decision was made. She would attend, not to fight, not to gloat, but to stand in truth, to show Paul and perhaps herself that the story had been rewritten, and she no longer needed his approval. When she told Annabelle, her friend groaned in frustration, then sighed. You're stubborn, she muttered. But if you must go, you won't go as the Naomi he remembers. You will go as the Naomi God restored. The preparations became a quiet rebellion against everything Paul once told her she wasn't. Annabelle insisted on helping her find a gown. They combed through boutiques until Naomi's eyes fell on it, a long golden dress that shimmered without shouting. Regal, yet simple. When she tried it on, the fabric hugged her form like it had been waiting for her. Naomi, Annabelle breathed, tears in her eyes. You look like victory. For the twins, Naomi chose matching suits, tiny, elegant, with bow ties that made them giggle in the mirror. We look like Daddy, one of them said proudly, pointing at Tony, who stood smiling in the doorway. Naomi's heart swelled. Her boys weren't reminders of her pain. They were living, breathing evidence of her redemption. And then came the final touch, the car. Not just any car, Annabelle insisted, determination flashing in her eyes. If Paul wants to flaunt, let's show him grace can arrive with style. So they booked a Bentley Continental GT, sleek and black, polished to perfection. Naomi hesitated at first. Isn't that too much? Annabelle shook her head firmly. No, you deserve to arrive in dignity, not in doubt. Let him see the woman who rose from the ashes. When Naomi told Tony about her decision, she braced herself for resistance. But Tony only took her hands, his eyes full of quiet understanding. You don't need to prove anything, Naomi, he said gently. Not to Paul, not to the world. But if going helps you heal the last wound, if it helps you stand fully in your truth, then I'm with you. She felt tears sting her eyes. I don't want revenge, Tony. I only want peace. And you shall have it, he said, kissing her forehead. I'll drive you there myself. But Naomi shook her head. No, Tony, this is something I must do. Not alone, but not with you in the crowd. You've given me a new life, and I'll carry you in my heart. But that hall, that confrontation, is between me, my children, and the past that once tried to bury me. Tony held her gaze, then nodded. Then go, Naomi. Go and show them the woman you've become. The days leading up to the wedding felt strangely calm. Naomi moved through them with a quiet strength, her gown hanging ready, the boys practicing how to walk like little gentlemen, their bow ties slightly crooked. On the morning of the wedding, Naomi stood before the mirror, adjusting her dress. She saw not the Naomi who once wept on the floor of Paul's mansion, begging him to stay. She saw a woman clothed in dignity, crowned with peace, holding in her heart the laughter of her children and the love of a man who cherished her. Annabelle entered the room, her eyes soft with pride. Are you ready? Naomi smiled. I've been ready for years. Outside, the Bentley purred, waiting. The twins, dressed and excited, held her hands. Together they walked toward the car, every step an echo of triumph. As the driver opened the door, Naomi looked back once more at the life she had built. The home filled with joy, the man who loved her, the friend who stood by her and whispered, "This is not about him anymore. This is about me walking into truth." The car door shut with a soft click. The engine roared to life. Naomi leaned back, her sons by her side, her golden gown catching the light. And with that, she was ready. Ready to face the man who once threw her away. Ready to stand where he wanted her, humiliated. Ready to show that God had rewritten her story. The day dawned bright and restless. The city had been waiting for this wedding, and Paul Higgins made certain the entire world knew it would be the event of the decade. Long before the sun rose, convoys of delivery trucks crowded the grand pavilion where the ceremony would take place. Florists carried mountains of lilies and roses flown in overnight from Europe. Electricians adjusted imported chandeliers that dripped with crystals like frozen rain. Cameramen set up their equipment, eager to capture every second of what promised to be an unforgettable spectacle. Outside, a scarlet carpet stretched from the entrance all the way to the street, flanked by golden ropes that kept back throngs of curious onlookers. Reporters held microphones, breathless with anticipation, as politicians' motorcades, celebrities' limousines, and tycoons' convoys began to arrive one after the other. Each arrival was a flash of wealth, a parade of status, and at the center of it all, the man who had orchestrated the show, Paul Higgins. Paul stood tall in his custom-made tuxedo, the fabric sleek and glossy under the chandelier light. Cameras captured his every smile as he shook hands, and basked in the applause of his guests. He wore pride like a crown, moving through the hall as though it were built just for him. "This is it," he whispered to himself, scanning the room filled with glittering gowns and polished shoes. "The world will never doubt me again." Beside him, Maggie, his mother, glowed with satisfaction. She whispered to him, "You see, my son, God has restored your honor. Angela will give you what Naomi never could." Paul smiled thinly, ignoring the uncomfortable weight of the words. He was determined not to think of Naomi today. This day was about his victory, his legacy. And then Angela appeared. The hall gasped collectively as she entered in Hungarian, an original from an Italian designer whose name was spoken like royalty. The fabric flowed like liquid light, every step catching the chandelier's gleam. Her veil was delicate lace, her crown of diamonds shimmering against her styled hair. Photographers scrambled, their flashes like lightning bolts across a midnight sky. Paul swelled with pride as she joined him. This was his proof, his declaration. Beside him stood not only beauty, but wealth, pedigree, and power. Music swelled from the orchestra, filling the air with grandeur. Guests settled into their seats, whispers buzzing about the extravagance, the perfection, the sheer spectacle of it all. Politicians nodded approvingly, celebrities smiled for the cameras, and society ladies whispered about the flowers, the dress, the wine. Paul raised his chin as the officiant prepared to begin. He scanned the hall, confident, untouchable. And then, the sound of an engine purred outside, low and smooth, slicing through the music. At first, no one paid attention. But as the Bentley Continental GT rolled to a stop at the edge of the scarlet carpet, heads began to turn. Its sleek black body gleamed like polished obsidian, its presence commanding without a word. The orchestra faltered for a moment. Guests leaned forward. Cameras swiveled. Paul's chest tightened. A chill ran through him as he recognized the car. "No," he whispered under his breath, though no one heard. The driver stepped out first, walking to the passenger side with deliberate grace. Then the door opened, and Naomi emerged. She stepped onto the carpet like a queen returning to her throne. Her golden gown shimmered in the sunlight, hugging her frame with dignity and strength. A soft breeze caught the hem, making it ripple like liquid fire. But it wasn't just Naomi who stepped out. Two little boys followed, identical twins, dressed in sharp little suits, bow ties slightly askew, their tiny hands gripping their mothers firmly. Their eyes were bright, their steps proud. The crowd froze. Silence fell heavy and absolute, broken only by the clicking of cameras that couldn't resist the scene. That's Paul's ex-wife, Naomi, but wasn't she barren? Look, she has children. Not just children, twins. The whispers spread like wildfire, igniting the hall. Guests turned to each other, wide-eyed, murmuring, gasping. Even the reporters outside began narrating frantically into their microphones. Paul's vision blurred. He clutched the edge of his chair, his face paling. This wasn't the broken woman he had expected to slink in quietly. This wasn't the empty ex-wife he wanted to humiliate. This was Naomi, radiant, dignified, untouchable. And at her side, proof of everything he had denied her, two sons, his lie exposed in flesh and blood. His knees nearly buckled as he watched her walk. Each step Naomi took crushed his pride further. He had planned for her humiliation, but it was his humiliation that now bloomed under the chandeliers in front of every guest, every camera. Angela glanced at him, her brow furrowing. She had never seen Paul look so shaken. Naomi did not falter. Her chin lifted, her eyes calm. She didn't glance at Paul, not even once. She walked with her boys to the very front row, the seat Paul himself had ordered reserved for her humiliation. But when she sat, it was not in shame. It was in dignity. Naomi arranged her gown, adjusted the boys' suits, and smiled at them softly. She rested her hands in her lap, her posture straight, her presence commanding. The guests couldn't stop staring. To them, she looked less like a rejected ex-wife and more like royalty attending a coronation. Paul swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Every whisper, every camera flash, every stare reminded him of the truth he had worked so hard to bury. His plan had backfired spectacularly, and as the orchestra stumbled to resume the music, Paul knew with a sinking heart that the wedding meant to elevate him had instead become the stage for his greatest undoing. The music that had filled the grand pavilion faltered like a dying flame. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, eyes darting between Paul, frozen at the altar, and Naomi, seated like royalty with her sons in the front row. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken questions. Angela, radiant in her gown, felt the tension coil around her. She followed the current of whispers until her eyes locked on Naomi. At first, she didn't believe what she was seeing. A woman in gold, dignified, with two striking little boys whose presence made the room tremble. She turned slowly to Paul, her voice sharp and cutting through the silence like glass. "Who is she?" Paul's throat tightened, his lips parted, but no words came. Sweat traced his hairline. For a man who prided himself on commanding rooms, his voice abandoned him now. Angela repeated, louder this time, each word wrapped in steel. "Who is she?" The guests leaned forward, eager, breathless. Paul forced the words out, low, barely audible. "She's my ex-wife." The admission rippled through the crowd like a wave breaking on shore. Cameras clicked faster. Guests gasped, some covering their mouths in shock. Angela's eyes widened. Her hands trembled as they gripped her bouquet tighter. She swallowed hard, her voice quivering with any fury she tried to control. "And those children? The twins sitting beside her? Paul's lips moved, but no sound followed. His mind raced for explanations, excuses, lies that might stitch together a shield. But nothing came. His silence was louder than any confession. Angela's gaze flicked back to Naomi and the twins, then returned to Paul. She searched his face, looking for honesty, finding only shame. Her voice broke, this time filled with disbelief more than anger. You told me she was barren. Angela's words echoed against the chandeliered ceiling, bouncing back into the ears of every guest. She stepped back from Paul, shaking her head. You said she was worthless. You said she was a curse in your life, that you needed me because she couldn't give you an heir. And yet, she pointed toward Naomi, her veil trembling with her hand. She walks in today with twins, living proof that you are the liar, Paul, not her. The hall erupted, gasps, murmurs, shouts. Some guests stood, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Photographers nearly fell over themselves, flashes exploding like fireworks. Paul reached out instinctively. Angela, wait! But Angela's hands went to her veil. With deliberate slowness, she tore it from her head and flung it down at his feet. Diamonds glittered under the lights, now tainted by humiliation. Angela's voice, though trembling, was clear for all to hear. I will not marry a liar. Not today, not ever. She dropped her bouquet on the polished floor, the petals scattering like fallen dignity. Her heels clicked sharply as she turned, walking down the aisle that was meant to usher her into triumph but now carried her away from disgrace. Guests parted, whispering, staring. Some applauded her courage, others simply stared in shock. Cameras followed her every step, capturing the collapse of Paul Higgins's carefully constructed empire. Angela did not look back. Paul stood rooted at the altar, the room spinning. His bride was gone, his secret undone, his pride shattered. His mother, Maggie, covered her mouth with trembling hands, unable to look him in the eye. Guests shook their heads, whispering words like shame, liar, and curse. And there in the front row sat Naomi. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk. Her expression was calm, her hands resting gently on her son's shoulders. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was enough. Paul Higgins, the man who once thought himself untouchable, stood abandoned, disgraced, humiliated in the very place he had built to showcase his victory. The wedding of the year had become the downfall of a man's pride. For a long moment after Angela's veil hit the ground and she stormed out of the hall, silence reigned. The chandeliers sparkled overhead. Cameras flashed wildly. Whispers raced like fire. But at the heart of it all, Paul Higgins stood broken, a man undone by his own lies. And then slowly Naomi rose. Her gown shimmered like molten gold as she stood, her twins holding each of her hands. The murmurs hushed as though the entire hall recognized instinctively that something important was about to be spoken. Naomi's presence alone commanded attention, but when her lips parted, her voice carried with a strength that made even the chandeliers seem to lean closer. You called me barren, she said, her voice calm yet cutting through the hall like a blade of light. You called me a curse. You told the world I was worthless. And yet here I stand with my sons, proof that I was never the problem. Her words echoed against the marble walls, reverberating into the silence of every guest's conscience. I carried shame that was not mine. I wept prayers that heaven heard, even when you mocked me. And now God has proven the truth. What you threw away, he restored. What you despised, he multiplied. Gasps rose, tears shimmered in the eyes of women who had once whispered about her in pity, and men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to look her in the eye. Naomi's expression softened as she bent slightly to touch her son's shoulders. I no longer carry bitterness. I do not need revenge. I have peace, and I walk away whole. With that, Naomi turned gracefully. The twins clutched her hands tightly, proud and unafraid. Together, they walked down the aisle that had once been meant for Angela's triumph and Paul's pride. Now it became Naomi's stage of vindication. The crowd parted for her. Photographers captured her every step, not as scandal but as glory. Even her footsteps seemed to sound like freedom against the polished marble floor. Outside, the Bentley Continental GT waited, sleek and dignified, its doors open like arms. The driver bowed slightly as Naomi approached. She helped her sons inside, their bow ties bobbing as they climbed in with cheerful innocence. Before stepping into the car herself, Naomi paused and glanced back once. She did not look at Paul. She looked at the hall, at the crowd, at the society that had once mocked her, and then she lifted her chin, her eye bright with quiet triumph. Then she entered the Bentley, the door closed, and with a gentle purr, the car pulled away. The guests spilled outside, watching in stunned silence as the golden woman in the Bentley disappeared into the distance. That evening, Paul came to Naomi's home, not with cameras or chauffeurs or reporters, just himself, deflated, stripped of pride. He knocked, his hand trembling, his heart heavy with regret. Naomi opened the door slowly, her sons playing in the background, their laughter a melody of the life she now lived. Naomi, Paul's voice cracked. He looked nothing like the man who had strutted down red carpets. His tuxedo was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. Please, I was wrong. I didn't know. I thought. Naomi raised a hand, silencing him gently. Her face was calm, not hardened, but firm. Paul, you crushed me once. You made me believe I was nothing. You let your pride and your mother's poison break a marriage that could have been whole. But I am not here to relive it. Tears welled in his eyes. Please, Naomi, give me another chance. Forgive me. She inhaled deeply, then spoke words that freed her soul once more. I forgive you, Paul, but I have moved on. Forgiveness is not the same as return. My life is not with you anymore. Paul staggered back as though her words had struck him. He nodded faintly, unable to speak further, and turned away into the night. Naomi's life with Tony and the twins blossomed like a garden after rain. Their home echoed with laughter, with small feet pattering down hallways, with conversations that lingered long into the night. Tony held her close during storms, celebrated her during victories, and carried her heart gently each day. Annabelle remained ever present, the friend who had believed in her when Naomi no longer believed in herself. Together, they built not only businesses, but a circle of joy, neighbors who respected friends who admired her strength, children who adored her. Every time Naomi watched her twins chase each other through the yard, she whispered under her breath, "You gave me double for my shame." For Paul, however, the days grew darker. His empire began to crumble, slowly at first, then with brutal speed. Investors pulled back, scandal tainted his name, and whispers of his humiliation followed him wherever he went. Maggie, once proud and sharp-tongued, sat in regret. She replayed her words against Naomi in her mind, realizing too late how her venom had destroyed her son's only true marriage. Angela's family severed ties, retreating into their wealth, leaving Paul isolated. And in the silence of his grand mansion, Paul faced the emptiness he had once accused Naomi of carrying. His life was filled with noise, but none of it brought peace. Loneliness became his companion, regret his bedfellow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Naomi walking away in gold, her sons at her side. Naomi, once the broke ex-wife cast out with nothing but a suitcase, was now a testimony. She had walked through ashes and emerged with beauty. Where the world had labeled her barren, God had written mother. Where Paul had called her a curse, she had become a blessing. Her story stood as a mirror to all who watched. Dignity, faith, and resilience could transform even the cruelest rejection into triumph. And as she rocked her sons to sleep one evening, Tony's hand resting gently on her shoulder, Naomi whispered, "I am no longer what they called me. I am free. I am whole. I am loved." The night sky stretched overhead, full of stars that shimmered like promises kept, and somewhere in the shadows of his crumbling empire, Paul Higgins wept, haunted by the truth that the woman he had once rejected had been the one who carried the legacy he longed for. Naomi had become the living proof. Faith and dignity could turn ashes into beauty.